The air, thick with the metallic tang of old blood and sterile cleaner, pressed in. A faint, rhythmic wheeze from unseen mechanisms filled the void. I remember a dim hospital hallway with no staff, machines quietly breathing, stretching into an impossible distance, its fluorescent glow a sickly yellow. A chill, not of temperature, but of profound absence, settled deep in my bones. I shook it off, a physical shudder passing through me, and returned my gaze to the parchment spread beneath the steady beam of my lamp. My world, usually a sanctuary of precise lines and measured distances, felt suddenly fragile. As a historical cartographer, I lived by the immutable truth of coordinates, the elegance of a perfectly rendered contour. My hands, calloused not from labor but from the delicate friction of graphite on vellum, had charted forgotten trade routes and resurrected ancient boundaries. Every stroke was a testament to order, to the belief that even the most convoluted landscapes could be understood, quantified, and ultimately, contained within the confines of a map. My small studio, nestled in a quiet corner of the city, was my fortress against the unquantifiable. Shelves heavy with leather-bound atlases formed battlements. The scent of aged paper and ink was my incense. Here, I found solace in the methodical, the verifiable. Until the letter arrived. It came with the weight of generations, sealed with a crest I barely recognized, belonging to a branch of my lineage I had always considered extinct, or at least, irrelevant. The solicitor's pronouncement was curt. A distant relative, the last of their line, had passed, leaving me the sole inheritor of the ancestral estate. A place so remote it barely registered on modern charts, a forgotten blot of land on the edge of the world. My initial reaction was a detached curiosity, a professional interest in a new, unmapped territory. The journey was a descent into a forgotten age. Paved roads dissolved into gravel tracks, then into rutted earth paths swallowed by encroaching wilderness. The air grew heavy, damp with the smell of decay and something else, something ancient, like whetstone and undisturbed earth. When the estate finally emerged from the shroud of overgrown trees, it was not the grand, if faded, manor I had half expected. Instead, it was a hulking, skeletal thing of gray stone and sagging timbers, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world that had long since forgotten it. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the walls, claiming them for the earth. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the groan of settling wood and the rustle of my own steps on dust-laden floorboards. Each room was a mausoleum of forgotten lives, filled with furniture draped in white shrouds that made them resemble spectral figures. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, dry rot, and something vaguely metallic, like old pennies or dried blood. I moved through the decaying halls with a strange reverence, a trespasser in my own inheritance. It was in a small, windowless study, choked with generations of forgotten documents and ephemera, that I found it. Tucked away beneath a pile of yellowed land deeds and a child's desiccated toy soldier, lay a rolled parchment. My cartographer's instincts pricked. Unfurling it on a cleared space of a heavy oak desk, I felt a tremor of anticipation. It was a map, unmistakably so, but unlike any I had ever encountered. The scale was meticulous, the hand that drew it impossibly precise. Every creek, every rise, every ancient oak on the estate's sprawling grounds was rendered with breathtaking fidelity, a testament to a cartographer of immense skill. I traced the delicate lines of a stream, noted the minute variations in elevation, admiring the artistry. But then, my professional admiration curdled into unease. The map was incomplete. Not merely unfinished, but riddled with deliberate blanks, large swaths of the estate left as blank vellum, yet bordered by intricate, almost obsessive detail and the symbols. They were not the conventional markers of property lines, nor the standard iconography for geology or flora. Instead, arcane shapes, like twisted runes, dotted the margins and appeared at the edges of the blank spaces. Some were vaguely geometric, others disturbingly organic, resembling skeletal structures or insectoid forms. They seemed to hum with a silent, malevolent energy. One particular feature held my gaze, a series of concentric circles, deep within a heavily forested, unmapped section of the estate, rendered with an almost ritualistic precision. No legend explained them, no accompanying text offered a clue. They simply were, a stark, unsettling anomaly on an otherwise brilliant piece of cartography. My initial professional curiosity, the thrill of an unknown challenge, began to fray. This was more than an incomplete map. It felt like a puzzle designed not to be solved, but to be feared. The estate, my inheritance, suddenly felt less like a possession and more like a trap. I found myself staring at the map, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs, a new, terrifying obsession taking root in the quiet chambers of my mind. What secrets lay buried beneath these ancient, malevolent lines, sickly yellow? I bolted upright, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, the memory of that antechamber of sterile dread clinging to me like a shroud. A bead of sweat traced a cold path down my temple. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the rough wool of the antique rug a grounding presence beneath my bare feet. Today, the map called to me. The intricate, hand-drawn document, with its faded inks and cryptic symbols, lay spread across the dining table downstairs, a silent challenge. It was a cartographer's obsession, a puzzle demanding resolution. My meticulous nature, honed by years of transcribing forgotten boundaries and charting lost territories, demanded that I reconcile its ancient lines with the tangible reality of the estate. This land, this house, this map, they were my inheritance, and I intended to understand every inch of them. Sunlight, fractured by dirty leaded glass, patterned the hall floor in shifting tessellations. The map glowed under the weak morning light, its parchment brittle, its edges frayed. I traced a finger along a faded contour, then cross-referenced it with the modern survey deeds I'd brought with me. The discrepancies were immediate, stark. Areas marked as unaccounted forest on the contemporary documents were rendered on my ancestral map with a peculiar, almost deliberate blankness, as if the cartographer had simply chosen not to depict what lay there. Conversely, the old map hinted at structures, faint etchings of stone and timber, in places where the modern records showed only unbroken woodland. Equipped with a compass, a measuring tape, and a well-worn field notebook, I stepped out into the crisp autumn morning. The air was surprisingly still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The estate grounds, once manicured, had long since succumbed to the wild embrace of nature. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, choked ancient oaks, and thorny brambles formed impenetrable walls where once there might have been paths. The ground underfoot was uneven, a treacherous mix of loose stones and tangled roots. Within minutes, I found my first anomaly. Barely visible beneath a shroud of creeping moss and fern, a low, crumbling wall emerged. It wasn't on the modern deeds, nor was it a simple dry stone fence. Its blocks were too large, too precisely cut for a boundary marker, and its construction hinted at a much older, more formidable purpose. It snaked deeper into the undergrowth, disappearing into a dense thicket of gnarled hawthorn bushes. I pushed through the thorny barrier, my coat snagging, my skin prickling. Here, the light failed to penetrate fully, even at midday. A peculiar sound reached my ears then, a faint, almost imperceptible scraping, like stone against stone, or perhaps something heavier being dragged. Not circles in the earth, but 3 standing stones, rough-hewn and lichen-stained, arranged in a crude triangle. They were not grave markers, nor did they delineate property lines. They stood perhaps 5 feet tall, their surfaces weathered smooth in places, pitted in others, their purpose utterly inscrutable. I ran my hand over the cool, rough surface of one, feeling the grit of ancient stone against my palm. These were not random boulders, they had been placed, intentionally, with an unknown design. I knelt, carefully examining the base of the central stone, half expecting to find some inscription, some clue. I pulled my hand back, a prickle of unease blossoming in my chest. The deeper I delved, the more the land defied my cartographer's logic. The discrepancies were not minor errors, easily dismissed as archaic surveying techniques. They were fundamental ruptures in the landscape's narrative, hints of a reality that the modern world had chosen to forget, or perhaps, was compelled to ignore. I blinked, the intricate lines of the ancestral map a blur beneath my eyelids, then sharpened into stark detail as I forced them open. My hand, still clenched around the cool brass of my compass, ached with the tension of a dream I could not quite recall, only a lingering dread that clung to my skin like fine ash. I sat upright, the groan of the antique chair echoing in the cavernous room. It was only the isolation, I told myself, the relentless focus on the map, the weight of the family secrets pressing down. My cartographer's mind, accustomed to precision and verifiable fact, struggled to dismiss the unsettling residue of the dream, a feeling of being observed, even now, in the empty room. I rose, my joints protesting, and moved to the window. Beyond the leaded panes, the ancient oak trees, skeletal against the gray dawn, seemed to hold their breath. I spun, my gaze sweeping the courtyard, but there was nothing. A trick of light, I reasoned, or perhaps my own tired eyes, playing games in the nascent light. Returning to the desk, I reached for my magnifying glass, a heavy, silver-rimmed instrument. It wasn't where I'd left it. I was certain I'd placed it precisely to the left of the inkwell. Now, it rested on the opposite side, nestled amongst a pile of parchment scrolls. I paused, my brow furrowed. I was meticulous, almost pathologically so. Every tool had its place, every document its designated stack. Had I moved it unconsciously? Had I, in the depths of my cartographic trance, simply forgotten? It was plausible, certainly. My focus on the map had been absolute, almost obsessive, these past weeks. I picked up the glass, its cool metal a small, solid comfort against the growing abstraction of my thoughts. As the day progressed, the subtle encroachments deepened. While hunched over a particularly dense section of the map, meticulously charting an old, forgotten bridle path, I heard it. A faint scraping, like fingernails dragging across rough stone, emanating from somewhere deep within the walls of the study. I froze, my quill suspended mid-stroke. The sound ceased as quickly as it began. Nothing. Only the thrum of my own pulse in my ears. I dismissed it as the house, old and weathered, merely stretching its ancient bones. That night, sleep offered no true respite. My dreams became a swirling maelstrom of fragmented images and suffocating sensations. The air grew heavy, tasting of damp soil and something else, something metallic and ancient, a flavor that mirrored the phantom tang from my waking moments. I felt the immense pressure of the land above me, a crushing weight that stole my breath, and heard, somewhere just beyond the barrier of the soil, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through my very bones, a sound that was both a lament and a demand. The next morning, the map beckoned with a new, insidious allure. I found myself drawn to a specific section, an area depicting the estate's western boundary, where the land sloped down into a dense, untamed thicket. I had spent days on this particular segment, comparing it with every historical deed and surveyor's note I could unearth. And yet, there it was. It wasn't a path. It wasn't a stream. I leaned closer, my magnifying glass held steady. I had meticulously cross-referenced every known feature, every ancient marker, against my own surveys. This line, this strange, almost organic pattern, was new. I knew it with the certainty of a man who had committed every inch of this parchment to memory. My finger traced its phantom path. My logical mind, my fortress of reason, began to develop hairline fractures. They were threads, slowly, meticulously being woven into a tapestry of unsettling coherence. The estate was no longer just a collection of stone and timber, it was a living, breathing presence, and it was beginning to stir. I blinked, the yellow lamplight a harsh sting after the sickly luminescence of my vision. The map lay splayed before me, its incompleteness a gaping wound on the parchment. That hallucination, so vivid, so utterly real in its fleeting horror, was a catalyst. It was no longer enough to merely understand the estate's geography. I needed to comprehend its very essence, to peel back the layers of time that had settled like grave soil over its true nature. It held memory, enshrined in forgotten corners. I began my search in the grand, decaying library, a cavernous space choked with generations of neglect. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and decaying leather. My fingers, trembling slightly despite my determination, traced the spines, seeking not the grand historical tomes, but the more intimate, overlooked relics. In a forgotten alcove, behind a crumbling set of encyclopedias, I found them, a collection of bound journals, their covers faded to an indistinguishable gray, and a small, wooden box filled with brittle, tied letters. The first journal I opened belonged to an ancestor, a woman named Ilara, who had resided here in the late 18th century. Her script, initially elegant, grew increasingly erratic with each turning page. Her early entries spoke of the estate's beauty, the tranquility of the surrounding woods. But then, a shift. The peculiar hum from beneath the earth, she wrote, her pen pressing deeply into the paper, grows louder with the moon's wane. My eyes darted to my map. Ilara had drawn crude sketches in the margins of her journal, marking locations with a frantic hand. These were the very areas I had found either blank or only vaguely sketched on my inherited map, the incomplete sections that had so vexed me. The letters in the wooden box were even more disturbing. Correspondence between a distant cousin and Ilara's husband, written years after her final journal entry. I confess, one letter read, "My concern for Ilara deepens. She rarely leaves the property, and her eyes hold a light I do not recognize." Another, penned by a different hand, a local solicitor, spoke of Ilara's unexplained disappearance, and the unsettling patterns of misfortune that seemed to plague the family line. The solicitor noted a disturbing number of ancestral residents who had either vanished or succumbed to a peculiar form of melancholia and delusion while living on the estate. Madness, disappearances, a pervasive sense of unease, all tied to the very land I now walked. I was not just uncovering history, I was awakening it. And I feared what it would demand in return for its secrets. Dot replaced the sharp tang of antiseptic. It was a waking nightmare, a sliver of the impossible bleeding into the familiar, suffocating silence of my study, leaving behind a residue of terror that clung to my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands into them until faint, swirling motes of light danced behind my eyelids. The estate had begun to claim my waking hours, twisting the edges of reality until the solid oak desk before me seemed to ripple, the ancestral portraits on the walls shifting their gazes with an unnerving, almost imperceptible slowness. The subtle disquiet that had been my constant companion now sharpened into a jagged blade, pressing against my sanity. They no longer merely hinted at secrets, they spoke. Directly, their voices a dry, rustling chorus that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the house. "You see." "Read," they hissed, a chorus of brittle leaves skittering across a parched ground, "you understand now." And then, clearer. My gaze fell upon the incomplete map, spread across the desk. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my own breath misting in the air, a fragile, fleeting cloud. Then it began. A tremor, subtle at first, vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet. It wasn't the distant rumble of an earthquake or a passing heavy vehicle, it was an internal thrum, originating from deep within the earth beneath the estate. A framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a stern-faced ancestor glaring out from sepia tones, slid an inch to the left, then an inch back, as if nudged by an unseen hand. The movement was too deliberate, too precise to be random. I pushed back from the desk, my chair scraping loudly against the polished wood. From the corner of my eye, a flicker. Within its indistinct outline, I perceived a movement, a slow, deliberate turning, as if it were observing me. It was not an apparition in the traditional sense, no spectral figure in flowing white, but something far more primal, a tear in the fabric of existence given shape. My breath hitched. The blood calls. A small, antique compass, a family heirloom I kept on the desk, suddenly spun wildly, its needle refusing to settle, oscillating between impossible directions. Then, with a sharp, resonant crack, the glass face shattered, showering tiny shards across the map. This was no longer the subtle haunting of a troubled house. This was an active, aggressive force, intent on making its presence known. My attempts to rationalize, to dismiss these events as fatigue or stress, crumbled under the weight of undeniable reality. The compass, a tool of absolute direction, had been violently broken. I needed help. No signal. I tried the landline, the ancient rotary phone in the hall. Dead. The lines, I knew, were buried deep, protected by the very earth that now seemed to seethe with an ancient malevolence. I was trapped. Desperate, I tried to start my car, the old pickup truck parked outside the crumbling stables. The engine sputtered, coughed, then died, refusing to catch. It cut across the map, intersecting the very spot where I suspected the estate's hidden feature lay. It wasn't a line I had drawn. It was a crude, menacing symbol, deeply gouged into the wood, a declaration, a warning, or perhaps, an invitation to something I could not yet fathom. My isolation was complete, and the entity, whatever it was no longer merely observing, it was acting, speaking, demanding. And it knew my name. It wasn't real, couldn't be. My rational mind, that meticulous cartographer's instrument, fought against the memory, yet the cloying scent of antiseptic, sharp and sterile, seemed to linger on my tongue even now, here in the dusty quiet of the estate study. I had stumbled, gasped, clawed my way back to the waking world, back to the familiar, oppressive weight of these ancient walls, but the edges of reality felt frayed, thin. Sleep offered no respite, only vivid reprises of that empty, echoing corridor, the rhythmic hiss and sigh of unseen mechanisms, a horrifying lullaby. My determination, usually a steadfast companion, now felt like a desperate, trembling hand gripping a crumbling rope. I needed answers. The map. Always the map. The lamp cast a bruised yellow glow across the oak table, illuminating the parchment like a stage for an unfolding tragedy. My fingers, surprisingly steady despite the tremor in my soul, traced the lines, the symbols, the familiar, intricate topography of the estate grounds. But tonight, I saw them differently. Not as features of the land, but as components of a vast, interlocking mechanism. I had spent weeks poring over the map, cross-referencing it with historical surveys, geological data, even the sparse, cryptic entries in the family journals. Tonight, though, my gaze snagged on a series of faint, almost imperceptible script hidden within the intricate crosshatching of the central diagram. I remembered a small, leather-bound volume I'd found tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the library, filled with archaic script and unsettling woodcut illustrations. My hands, guided by an instinct I no longer questioned, found it. The hours bled into a single, agonizing smear of lamplight and strained vision. I cross-referenced, I decoded, I felt my mind stretch and crack under the strain of the revelations slowly blooming on the page. The small book wasn't a family history, as I had initially assumed, but a lexicon. A key to the map's true purpose. The symbols weren't navigational markers. They were wards. The intricate lines of the estate weren't pathways to hidden treasures, but arteries of power, converging on a central point marked by a symbol I now recognized as a stylized, ancient glyph for imprisonment. The map was not a guide to something, but a diagram of something. A cage. A seal. My breath hitched, catching in my throat like a shard of glass. The hidden features I had so diligently sought were not architectural marvels or forgotten passages. They were anchors. Points of immense, focused energy designed to hold something down. And what was it that needed such elaborate containment? Not an entity of flesh and blood, not a spirit or a ghost, but something far older, far more fundamental. Something that had been buried deep beneath this land, contained by the very earth itself, and by the intricate, powerful architecture of the map. The map, I realized with a sickening lurch, was not merely incomplete, it was fading. The lines, which I had once attributed to the decay of old parchment, were described in the lexicon as threads of binding, and they were weakening. The very ink seemed to recede into the paper in places, blurring the intricate patterns, creating gaps in the protective lattice. They were symptoms. Signs that the seal was failing. My gaze fell upon a section of the map, a blank space where the final, crucial lines of containment should have been. And next to it, a translated passage from the lexicon, its archaic words piercing me with their terrible clarity, the blood remembers. The hand that draws the prison, alone may strengthen its chains, or shatter them forever. I wasn't just an heir, a cartographer drawn by a professional curiosity. I was part of this. My lineage, which I had always dismissed as mere historical accident, was inextricably linked to this ancient horror. I had been drawn to this decaying estate not by chance, but by some grim, ancestral imperative. The map, this terrifying legacy, wasn't just something to complete for academic satisfaction. It was a choice. My choice. To complete the map, to fill in those fading lines, to reinforce the failing seal, and contain the undreamed presence. Or, in my ignorance, my frantic search for hidden features, to inadvertently finish the decay, to break the last remaining threads, and release it. I looked at the map, then at my trembling hands. The weight of centuries, the fate of something unimaginable, pressed down on me. I was not just Reed, the cartographer. I was the last link in a terrible chain, poised at the precipice of a choice that could either save this fragile world from an ancient horror, or unleash it entirely. And the thought, terrifying and undeniable, settled deep in my bones. It was already watching. The ancient impermanence, the chilling whisper of a forgotten name, had clung to me like grave dust. My lineage, once a distant abstraction, now felt like a living, festering wound, drawing me deeper into the estate's grim embrace. I was not merely an observer, I was the inheritor of a terrible burden, a cartographer charting not just land, but damnation. The very air in the study thickened, a viscous syrup that coated my lungs. The lamp, though recently refilled, cast a sickly, jaundiced glow, barely piercing the gloom that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. My eyes, red-rimmed and burning from days of relentless study, traced the spiraling script of an old journal, its leather binding cracked and brittle like desiccated skin. It was not a language I knew, yet I understood. The words were not read, but felt, a cold tendril uncoiling in the hollow of my skull. Then, the world around me fractured. My senses reeled, then sharpened, focusing on a new, unsettling reality. I stood in a dim hospital hallway with no staff, machines quietly breathing. The sterile scent of antiseptic was a cruel mockery, a thin veil over something far more putrid. The machines hummed, a low, rhythmic sigh that felt like the labored breath of a dying titan. Each metallic thrum vibrated through the soles of my feet, a phantom heartbeat in the profound emptiness. A voice, not of air or throat, but of pure, distilled thought, coiled into my mind. It was a chorus of forgotten agonies, a symphony of starved earth, a promise of ultimate, blissful surrender. You are mine, it slithered, a silken cord tightening around my will. You were always mine. Your blood, your name, your meticulous hand that seeks to chart the unchartable. All lead to me. A torrent of images crashed through my consciousness, skeletal trees clawing at a blood-red sky. The earth itself tearing open like a maw, faces contorted in silent screams, all bound by an unseen, crushing weight. It was attempting to possess me, to merge its ancient hunger with my own desperate need for understanding. I fought back, a silent scream of defiance. My meticulous mind, my cartographer's discipline, became my shield. I clung to the known, to the lines and angles, the precise measurements that defined my world. No, I thought, a desperate anchor in the psychic storm. I am Reed. I chart, I define. Yet, within the maelstrom, a flicker of something else emerged, a memory from the ancient journal I had been studying before this terrifying displacement. A fragment of a symbol, a sequence of almost forgotten words, now burned into my mind with sudden, startling clarity. It was a countermeasure, a ritual hinted at in the obscure texts, a way to reseal the horror I had unwittingly unleashed. The knowledge was not a gentle revelation, it was a blade twisting in my gut. To reseal it, I had to sever the very tether that bound it to this world, a tether that had strengthened through generations of my own bloodline. The ritual demanded a profound personal sacrifice, not of flesh, but of identity. I, Reed, the cartographer obsessed with lineage and precision, had to irrevocably break my own connection to the estate's history, to willingly become an outsider to my own past. It required an act of immense will, a complete renunciation of the ancestral legacy I had sought to understand and preserve. The weight of it pressed down on me, heavier than any stone. To deny my blood, to sever the very thread that connected me to this land, was to erase a part of myself, to become a map with no origin, a history with no beginning. It was a sacrifice that would leave me rootless, adrift. But the alternative. The vision of the land tearing open, the faces contorted in silent screams, the insatiable hunger that sought to consume all. The stakes were no longer confined to the decaying estate or my own sanity. The fate of the land, the quiet breathing of the machines in this desolate hallway, the very fabric of the world beyond these walls, seemed to tremble on the precipice of my decision. I had opened the door, and now, I alone held the key to locking it again, even if the price was the loss of myself. The entity's last pulse had left me adrift, a vessel without a rudder on a black, churning sea. When the oppressive weight lifted, it did not release me to the familiar dust and decay of the estate, but into a disorienting, sterile void. I stood, swaying, in a dim hospital hallway with no staff, machines quietly breathing. The air, instead of the earth's ancient, musty breath, held the sharp, metallic tang of disinfectant, a scent utterly alien to the ancestral home. Fluorescent lights, half-dead, flickered above, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched and crawled like starved things across the linoleum. Each breath seemed to echo too loudly in my own chest. This was not real. It could not be. My mind, still reeling from the entity's psychic assault, struggled to grasp the edges of this new reality. The journal. The symbol. It was a lifeline, a thread of truth in this tapestry of lies. The entity sought to disorient, to paralyze me with an illusion of vulnerability, of being trapped, cared for in a place that offered no true care. A guttural roar, not of sound but of pure psychic force, tore through the hallway. The entity was screaming its displeasure, its fury at my recognition of its trickery. The symbol, a swirling knot of lines from the journal, solidified in my mind. It was a key, a ward, a path. I would descend. I must. The metallic tang dissolved, replaced by the damp, earthy scent of ancient soil. The flickering lights gave way to the encroaching gloom of a cavernous opening, a maw in the earth beneath the oldest part of the cellar. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of whetstone and something else, something cloying and sweet, like decaying blossoms mixed with old blood. This was the place, the forgotten chamber the incomplete map had hinted at, the ultimate resting place of the estate's grim secret. The descent was a narrow, winding passage, cut crudely into the rock, slick with condensation. Each step echoed, swallowed by the vast emptiness below. It began its assault anew. My mother's soft murmur, my father's stern advice, twisted into accusations, into pleas for me to turn back, to abandon this foolhardy quest. Spectral shapes flickered in the periphery, vague forms that shifted and writhed, just out of my direct gaze. My own memories turned against me, flashing images of failure, of loss, of moments I wished to forget, all magnified and distorted by the entity's malevolence. The ground beneath my feet grew uneven, littered with fragments of bone and splintered wood. The torchlight revealed grotesque calcifications on the walls, mineral growths that twisted into shapes resembling grasping hands, tormented faces. Then, a new obstacle. The passage ahead was blocked by a sudden rockfall, a jagged pile of enormous stones that seemed to have materialized from the very rock face. The entity wasn't just assaulting my mind, it was actively shaping my environment. I saw no way around, no path over. The map, now almost fully revealed in my memory, showed a hidden crawlspace, a forgotten fissure. I scrambled over the loose scree, searching, my fingers scraping against the rough stone. A gust of fetid air, smelling of deep earth and something indescribably ancient, brushed against me. It was a current, a sign. It was barely wide enough for me to pass. Squeezing through the tight crevice, the rock pressing against my chest, I felt a profound sense of claustrophobia, a primal fear of being buried alive. This was it. The chamber. It was a circular cavern, larger than any I had anticipated, its ceiling lost in the gloom above. The air here was still and heavy, vibrating with an unseen energy. In the very center, bathed in the dim, flickering light of my torch, stood an altar. And beneath it, etched into the very floor of the chamber, was a symbol, vast and complex, a perfect, horrifying mirror of the fragment from the journal, now complete. But it was not merely a symbol of binding or warding. It was a conduit, a vessel. And then I understood the true, terrifying nature of the ritual, the horrifying purpose of the offering. The basin was not for a sacrifice to the entity, but for something to be placed within the entity, for its recontainment, for its binding. And the map, the journal, my lineage. They were not just leading me to defeat it, but to become a vital, horrifying component of its eternal imprisonment. The air here was thin, scrubbed clean of the earth's scent, a sharp chemical tang assaulting my nostrils. Fluorescent lights hummed with a low, insistent drone, casting long, stark shadows that writhed with an impossible life of their own. My hands, usually stained with ink and soil, appeared unnaturally pale, almost translucent, against the pristine white of a wall that offered no texture, no history, no purchase for my cartographer's gaze. This place, however, was a map without contours, a space without true dimension. My mind, trained to measure and delineate, found no logic in its endless, featureless expanse. The rhythmic shhh thump of unseen machinery was too perfect, too monotonous, an echo in a chamber that swallowed all sound. There were no fire exits, no electrical panels, no water pipes, none of the intricate veins and arteries that define a true structure. A trap. This was the entity's final gambit, a psychic prison designed to sever my will, to drown me in an artificial sanity before the true confrontation. My heart, a frantic drum against my ribs, told me this was not real. My cartographer's eye, searching for the telltale signs of a genuine place, found only flawless deception. The map, the true map, pulsed behind my eyes, a vibrant, complex tapestry of lines and symbols that mocked this sterile lie. The hum of the machines faltered, then intensified, a sudden cacophony of white noise that threatened to deafen me. With a primal roar that tore from deep within my chest, I pushed against the illusion, against the suffocating lie. The wall buckled, then tore, like paper dissolving in water. The sterile white bled into a swirling vortex of black and ochre, the chemical tang replaced by the rich, damp scent of ancient earth and decaying stone. The rhythmic breathing of the machines dissolved into a guttural moan that echoed from the very foundations of the world. The air, thick and heavy, tasted of minerals and the profound stillness of buried time. My eyes, adjusting to the gloom, found not the false hallway, but the rough-hewn walls of the underground chamber, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and acrid, like old blood. This was it. The true crucible. The chamber, which I had painstakingly mapped, now felt alive, a vast, breathing lung beneath the estate. The map itself, clutched in my trembling hand, seemed to radiate a faint, internal light, its lines glowing with an ethereal phosphorescence. I saw the convergence points, the specific symbols I had dismissed as mere decorative flourishes, now understood as critical nodes in a vast, ancient circuit. Reveal/discovery. The map was not merely a guide to the entity's prison, it was the prison's key. My life's work, the meticulous art of understanding space and its hidden geometries, had unknowingly prepared me for this. The lines I had drawn, the contours I had traced, were not just representations, they were conduits. It was not a drop in temperature, but an absence of warmth, a draining of vital heat from the air, from my very being. They spoke of endless time, of forgotten suffering, of a hunger that spanned millennia. I stumbled forward, tracing the glowing lines on the map with a trembling finger, my gaze fixed on the chamber walls. The entity's presence was a crushing weight, a pressure on my chest that made each breath a struggle. My head throbbed, a relentless drumbeat against my skull, and a thin trickle of blood began to seep from my nose, warm and sticky on my lip. I reached the first node, a shallow depression in the stone floor. Following the map's instruction, I poured a small vial of brackish water I had collected from the estate's deepest well into it. As the liquid settled, the depression glowed with a faint, blue luminescence. The entity responded with a psychic shriek, a soundless scream that vibrated through my bones, sending waves of nausea through me. "No!" I gasped, my voice raw. My will, though battered, held. I moved to the next point, a jagged fissure in the wall. The map showed a specific glyph. As the final line connected, a crackling sound, like static electricity, filled the chamber, and a faint, shimmering barrier, visible only at the edge of my perception, seemed to rise from the ground. The entity's resistance intensified. My vision blurred, tears stinging my eyes, but I pushed through, driven by a desperate, unwavering resolve. I moved from point to point, a frenzied dance of desperation and precision. Each drop of water, each etched symbol, each murmured incantation drawn from the map's obscure annotations, chipped away at the entity's hold, building the cage around it. Sweat plastered my hair to my forehead, mingling with the blood from my nose, blurring my vision. My muscles screamed in protest, but I ignored them, my focus absolute, a laser-like intensity fixed on the glowing map. Finally, I reached the central stone slab, the heart of the entity's power. The map showed a final, intricate pattern to be drawn directly onto its surface. My hands shook violently, but I forced them steady, using a shard of obsidian I had unearthed with the map itself. As I completed the last line, a profound tremor shook the entire chamber, dust raining down from the ceiling. A guttural roar, filled with ancient fury and thwarted malice, erupted from the slab, a sound that was less heard and more felt, tearing at the very fabric of my being. The air crackled with raw, malevolent energy, and for a terrifying moment, I felt myself being pulled, stretched, as if my soul were about to be ripped from my body. But then, as the last line of the ritual closed, a blinding flash of white light erupted from the slab, followed by a deafening crack that echoed through the underground chamber, shaking it to its foundations. I collapsed onto the damp earth, my body trembling uncontrollably, every muscle screaming in protest. The map, now dull and lifeless, slipped from my grasp. The obsidian shard clattered against the stone. The entity was contained. Banished. The estate was free. The meticulous order of my world had been irrevocably broken. I had won, but the cost was a piece of myself, a quiet corner of my soul that would forever bear the imprint of that boundless, terrible hunger. I was no longer just Reed, the cartographer. The air, thin and sharp, bit at my lungs, a stark contrast to the thick, ancient dust I had grown accustomed to. A low, rhythmic hiss-click emanated from behind a closed door further down the corridor, a sound both alien and unnervingly indifferent. My vision swam, the fluorescent light above flickering with a lazy, almost mocking cadence, painting the linoleum floor in sickly yellow and gray. My ears rang with an echo of the entity's final scream, a high-pitched keening that had burrowed into the marrow of my bones, a sound that refused to dissipate even amidst this new, unsettling quiet. I raised a hand, finding it heavy, clumsy. My fingers, once precise tools for delicate cartography, were now caked with dried earth and something darker, something that flaked away like old paint. A tremor ran through me, a deep-seated vibration that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with the lingering imprint of pure, unfettered malevolence. My clothes hung in tatters, stiff with grime and crusts of ancient soil. When I moved, a dull ache radiated from my ribs, and my skin felt stretched, tight, as if I had shed a layer of myself in the struggle. I ran a hand over my scalp, finding a sticky patch, a gash I hadn't known was there. The mirror, if one existed, would have shown a stranger. No one stirred. The hallway stretched, a long, empty tunnel of muted greens and off-whites. Doors lined either side, uniformly closed, offering no clue, no escape, no explanation. Each machine's quiet respiration seemed to mock my own ragged breathing, a testament to a world that continued its mundane functions while I had wrestled with something that defied all reason, all science. This place felt like a temporary holding cell between realities, a sterile dream from which I was desperate to wake. A desperate, primal need to return, to see if it was truly over, gnawed at me. I pushed open a heavy, unmarked door at the end of the corridor, revealing a gray, indifferent morning. The air outside was cool, crisp, utterly normal. Cars hummed past on a distant road. A bird chirped. The sheer ordinariness of it all was a fresh wound. The journey back to the estate was a blur, a waking nightmare of aching limbs and a mind still grappling with the impossible. I moved as if underwater, my senses dulled, the world a distant, indistinct hum. The sun, when it finally broke through the morning haze, felt alien on my ravaged skin. They knew nothing. They could never know. When the familiar, twisted oak that marked the estate's boundary finally appeared, I felt a strange lurch in my gut. The land itself seemed to recoil from me, or perhaps, I from it. The air grew heavy, the chirping of birds ceased. The estate, my ancestral home, was no longer a decaying monument to forgotten lives. It was a ruin, a scar etched into the earth. The grand house, once merely neglected, now stood as a skeletal wreck. A gaping maw had been torn through the central wing, exposing splintered beams and shattered plaster to the indifferent sky. The roof had collapsed in places, leaving jagged teeth of timber pointing accusingly upward. But it was the land around it that truly stole my breath. Where the ancient, gnarled trees had once stood, a vast, circular depression now marred the earth. It was a crater, blackened and scorched, as if a localized, silent inferno had swept through. The soil was barren, lifeless, turned to a fine, gray ash that still shimmered with an unholy sheen. No grass, no weed, no insect dared to approach its desolate perimeter. This was the true cost. Not just the house, but the very ground, the living memory of the land, had been consumed. I walked to the edge of the desolation, my feet sinking into the ash. The world was blissfully unaware, but I knew. And I would forever carry the weight of that knowing. The last pulse had left me adrift, a vessel without a rudder on a black, churning sea. The rhythmic hiss and sigh of unseen mechanisms were a mockery of a heartbeat, a cold, metallic pulse in the unnatural quiet. My skin felt too thin, stretched taut over bones that hummed with a strange, residual vibration. I pressed a hand to my temple, a dull throb echoing deep within my skull. The air, devoid of the estate's earthy musk and the entity's sickening perfume, tasted of ozone and something faintly metallic. I stumbled forward, my legs protesting the sudden freedom from unseen bonds. The corridor stretched, featureless, a tunnel of muted light. There was no destination, no direction, only the pervasive sense of an ending that had not quite concluded. A faint flicker, like a dying ember, stirred at the periphery of my vision, a memory of the land's raw power, of the ancient hunger. I shut my eyes, willing it away, willing myself away from this sterile purgatory. When I opened them again, the harsh, fluorescent glow was gone. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The rough, cold stone of the estate's cellar floor pressed against my cheek. I lay amidst shattered pottery and scattered implements, a fine layer of dust coating my clothes and hair. My body ached with a deep, bone-weary fatigue, as if every sinew had been stretched to its breaking point and slowly, painfully, reknitted. A tremor passed through the foundations, a low, guttural groan from the earth itself. Contained. A sigh, perhaps, of a monstrous thing settling back into its restless slumber. I pushed myself up, every joint protesting. The air, while heavy, no longer carried the cloying sweetness of rot that had permeated my every breath for weeks. The entity's presence, once a suffocating shroud, had receded to a distant hum beneath the soil, a deep, forgotten chord in the earth's symphony. The memory of what I had done, the price I had paid, was a jagged shard embedded in my mind. The sacrifice. The giving. Not of blood, not of life in the way I had feared, but of a deeper, more fundamental part of myself. A piece of my perception, a fragment of my very being, had been offered, a conduit for the vast, ancient hunger to briefly sate itself, to draw back from the brink of its full awakening. The exact nature of that exchange remained a blur, a terrifying lacuna in my memory, but the feeling of it, the profound, irrevocable shift within me, was undeniable. I climbed the winding stairs, each step an effort. The main house was a wreck of forgotten promises and broken glass. Sunlight, thin and watery, filtered through grimy windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stale air. The silence was broken only by the creak of settling timbers and the distant call of a crow. The maps, my life's work, lay scattered across the library floor, some stained with earth, others torn. I picked one up, a half-finished survey of the estate's northern woods. My cartographer's eye, once so precise, now saw dimensions that defied conventional measurement. The land breathed, I realized, with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The boundaries I had so meticulously drawn were mere illusions, thin veils over something far more ancient and fluid. The estate was not simply a collection of fields and forests, it was a living, breathing skin over a vast, dreaming consciousness. The next weeks blurred into a routine of survival and quiet observation. I cleared some of the debris, patched a few windows, made the kitchen vaguely functional. The practicalities of existence were a tether, pulling me back from the precipice of madness. The entity was there, quiescent, a colossal beast stirring in its sleep. And I, Reed, the cartographer, was its unwitting guardian. I found myself drawn back to the incomplete map, not with the obsessive need to finish it, but with a new, unsettling purpose. My hand, once guided by logic and measurement, now moved with an instinct I couldn't explain. I added lines, not of topography, but of unseen currents, of the land's hidden energies, of the entity's subtle dominion. The map became a living document of its presence, a silent testament to the price I had paid. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, when the wind moaned through the eaves and the house groaned around me, I would feel a whisper in the back of my mind. It was not a voice, not a command, but a subtle shifting of my own desires, a gentle nudge towards a certain path, a certain thought. A quiet suggestion to tend to a particular patch of overgrown woods, to reinforce a crumbling stone wall, to simply be here. I had contained the horror, yes, but at what cost? Was I truly free, or had I become merely another feature of the map, a living marker on the boundary of its endless slumber, subtly compelled to ensure its continued rest? The world outside the estate, the world of colleagues and former acquaintances, felt distant, irrelevant. They would not understand. They would see a man haunted by grief, perhaps, or driven to reclusive eccentricity. But they would never see the truth, that the horror was not gone, merely contained, its vast, ancient presence now a constant hum beneath my own skin, a silent, terrible symphony that only I could hear. I was the keeper of the map, and the keeper of the secret, bound to the land and to what lay beneath, for as long as the earth itself would have me.